Now, staying with news further afield, two key developments out of the United States overnight. On the East Coast, the United Nations Security Council passing a key resolution calling for urgent extended humanitarian pauses for a sufficient number of days to allow aid access to the Gaza Strip, whilst demanding that parties comply with their obligations under international law as it relates to the protection of civilians, especially children. Whilst on the West Coast, U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping meet face-to-face in a meeting for the United States is framing as having achieved real progress, including re-establishing direct military-to-military channels of communication that were suspended for months, as well as opening a presidential hotline between the leaders of the world's two superpowers. Take a look.
We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. And we also have to manage it responsibly, that competition. That's what the United States wants and what we intend to do. I also believe that's what the world wants for both of us, candid exchange. We also have a responsibility to our people and the work in the world to work together when we see it in our interest to do so. And the critical global challenges we face, from climate change to counter-narcotics to artificial intelligence, demand our joint efforts.
China-U.S. relationship has never been smooth sailing over the past 50 years or more, and it always faces problems of one kind or another. Yet it has kept moving forward amid twists and turns. For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides. I'm still of the view that major country competition is not the prevailing trend of current times and cannot solve the problems facing China and the United States or the world at large. Planet Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed, and one country's success is an opportunity for the other.
Well, for more, let's speak to our U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who has been monitoring key developments for us. Sherwin, good afternoon, South African time, and thank you for your time with us here at this hour. Perhaps you could speak to some of the key outcomes from this meeting in San Francisco between Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping. It's the first time that they've met face-to-face in 1 year.
Well, to quote the Chinese President Xi Jinping, this is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. The world's two strongest and largest economies, some of the strongest militaries in the world. And so when the leaders, with there's tension between the two capitals, there's often an expression used that when the elephants fight, the grass underneath gets trampled, in reference to smaller nations. And so a very important bilateral engagement between the leaders of the two superpowers. Some of the key takeaways: they've re-established a direct presidential hotline. So if one leader wants to talk to the other about a pressing issue, the theory goes that the other one will answer and pick up the phone. They've also resumed military-to-military communication, something that was suspended after the United States in February this year shot down what it believed was a Chinese spy balloon that traversed the length and breadth of the United States, creating additional tensions. The Chinese, of course, refer to this phenomena as a weather balloon. The United States has determined that it was a spy balloon, so they've resumed those military-to-military communications, and they will also work to curb fentanyl production and agreed to stem the exports from China of chemicals, Liesl, that are used in the production of this synthetic opioid. Fentanyl deaths in the United States reached an astronomical 75,000 in 2022. So a huge concern for the United States in terms of mitigating the fentanyl overdoses that have perpetuated and certainly affected so many Americans in this country. They also talked about, this tough issue around the independence of Taiwan. China talked about the peaceful reunification of Taiwan. But according to U.S. officials, he also talked about conditions where force could be used if necessary. President Biden, for his part, stressed the need for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and also pushed for the status quo to be maintained and for China to respect Taiwan's electoral processes. So some progress in the relationship, key among those, the fact that the two leaders have a hotline in which they can communicate directly. And of course, those key interlocutors in the military will now be able to engage directly with each other. Liesl?
Well, Sherwin, speaking of progress, the Chinese have then also expressed their displeasure with comments that President Biden made to the press after their 4-hour meeting, standing by earlier comments that he viewed President Xi as a dictator.
Yeah, this kumbaya moment, right, between the two leaders immediately undermined by comments made by President Biden in response to a question from a journalist. Last year, after their meeting in Bali, Indonesia, on the sidelines of the G20, Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator, and so a journalist asked him yesterday if he still held that view, given the positive effects that were produced by this meeting. Biden said he's a dictator in the sense that he's a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different from ours. So certainly not an incorrect interpretation from President Biden, labeling it in that way, but certainly received as an affront by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, saying it strongly opposes the remarks, calling the statement wrong and irresponsible political manipulation, adding that there will always be people with ulterior motives who attempt to incite and damage U.S.-China relations. You know, often comments like these are meant for a domestic audience, and I think that's what President Biden was playing at here. And it's not clear that these remarks, given that they are not new, will certainly undermine the good-natured agreements that have emanated from that meeting in San Francisco.
At the UN in New York, a major diplomatic accomplishment in that the Security Council was finally able to find relative consensus on a resolution to ease the humanitarian suffering of people in Gaza. Perhaps you could walk through what the key elements of it are and will it be implemented?
I mean, the word hallelujah comes to mind, right? I mean, if finally the Security Council able to produce a product where they speak with one voice, even though all 15 members of the Security Council didn't vote in favor of this. There were 3 abstentions from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. But let me briefly tell you what this does. It demands that all parties comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, especially with regard to the protection of children. It also calls for extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days. It doesn't specify how many days in particular, but calls for a series of days where this can happen to facilitate the continuous, sufficient and unhindered provision of essential goods and services, important to the well-being of citizens, especially children, and to enable the urgent rescue and recovery efforts, including for missing children, Liesl, that are trapped under mounds of rubble in Gaza. So this is a resolution that was framed around the protection of children in the main, and so we were able to reach some sort of consensus here. The question, though, is a victory. You can't really have a victory lap through passage of a resolution. The victory surely comes by the implementation of that resolution and its impact on the ground. Let me very quickly tell you what the Israeli ambassador said after the passage of that resolution. The UN Security Council's resolution is disconnected from reality and is meaningless. Regardless of what the Council decides, Israel will continue acting according to international law, while Hamas terrorists will not even read the resolution at all, let alone abide by it. It's unfortunate that the Council continues to ignore and not condemn or even mention the massacre that Hamas carried out on October 7th, which led to the war in Gaza. It is truly shameful. So, if we are to believe what the Israeli ambassador is saying, this resolution looks good on paper, but it's not necessarily going to change Israel's perspective, or certainly Israel's position in terms of what it's seeking to carry out on the ground in Gaza, Liesl.
Sherwin, let's continue to monitor developments from here too, but thank you for your time with us here at this hour. Sherwin Bryce-Pease as SABC U.S. correspondent, bringing us the latest following President Joe Biden meeting with Xi Jinping, as well as the UN resolution passed by the Security Council on the Israel-Hamas war.